There is a boat floating in the darkness. 53 feet of polished teak and brass. A luxury ketch that cost $220,000. A retirement dream built to carry two people into their golden years across open water. It was moored in one of the safest harbors in Tasmania. Private, quiet, just meters from shore. A place where nothing violent should ever happen. And yet, on the morning of January 27th, 2009, that boat was found sinking. Blood smeared across the companionway steps. A heavy flashlight, cracked and stained. A knife on the cabin floor. And the man who owned it, gone. This is the yacht murder that divides Australia to this day. Blood everywhere, but no body. Someone was convicted. Someone spent 13 years in prison. But the questions never stopped. The DNA that didn't match. The witness who disappeared. The midnight sighting no one could explain. The river that refused to give up its dead. In this investigation, we'll go aboard the Four Winds. We'll walk through the luxury that became a crime scene. The night that turned a dream into a nightmare. The evidence that both convicted and confused. The trial that split a nation. And the appeal that changed everything, or nothing at all. Was the verdict correct? Or has someone been punished for a crime they did not commit? Bob Chappell was 65 years old when he disappeared. A radiation physicist by trade, methodical, precise, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once. He had spent his career in the quiet corridors of science, working with isotopes, calibrating instruments, teaching young engineers the mathematics of decay. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady. And steady had been enough. Sue Neal Fraser was 54. She had worked in HR, in administration, in the background machinery of corporate Australia. Competent, reliable. The sort of person you didn't notice until something needed organizing. She and Bob had been together for 18 years by the time they bought the Four Winds. Not married, never felt the need, but bound by routine, by shared dinners and weekend sails, by the quiet companionship that comes when two people stop trying to impress each other and simply exist side by side. They were not rich, but they were comfortable. Bob's pension was secure. Sue had savings. They had talked, in that vague way people do when retirement looms, about doing something, traveling, sailing, getting out of the suburban grind. And then, in late 2008, they found it. The Four Winds, a 53-foot ketch-rigged yacht built in 1977. Classic lines, 2 masts, a long bowsprit that gave her an old-world elegance, the kind of boat you might see in a cigarette advertisement from the 70s. White hull cutting through azure water, sails taut against the wind, a couple in matching sweaters smiling at the helm. She was not new, not flashy, but she was beautiful in the way that well-maintained things are beautiful. Cared for, polished, loved. The yacht had been built in Sydney by a custom yard, designed for long-range cruising. Her hull was laid up in solid fiberglass, thick and heavy, built to take weather. The ketch rig, 2 masts instead of 1, gave her versatility. The main mast stood 40 feet tall, the mizzen slightly shorter, and together they carried over 800 square feet of sail. Below deck, she was appointed like a small floating apartment. Teak paneling throughout, brass fittings, a galley with a 4-burner stove, double sinks, and enough counter space to prepare a proper meal underway. A navigation station with a chart table and VHF radio. 2 cabins. A head with a marine toilet and shower. Everything you needed to live aboard for months at a time. Bob and Sue paid 220,000 Australian dollars for her. Not a fortune, but not pocket change either. They planned to refit her slowly. Fix the plumbing. Update the electronics. Replace the sails. Take their time. Make her theirs. By January 2009, they had owned the Four Winds for only a few months. She was moored in Sandy Bay, just off the Hobart waterfront, a few hundred meters from the Royal Yacht Club of Tasmania. Close enough to row ashore in the dinghy, far enough to feel separate. The mooring was a public spot, one of dozens scattered across the Derwent River, a wide tidal estuary that cuts through the heart of Hobart. At night, the city lights reflected off the water, and the boats rocked gently in their chains. And you could sit on deck with a glass of wine and feel like you had escaped something. Bob spent most of his time aboard. He was retired now, or semi-retired, and the boat had become his project. He would row out in the morning with a toolbox and a thermos of tea and tinker, fixing a leaking seal, rewiring a navigation light, sanding the teak handrails. Sue came and went. She still had commitments on shore, friends, errands. She was not as enamored with the boat as Bob was, but she went along with it. This was his dream. She was willing to try. January 26th, 2009 was Australia Day, a public holiday. The weather was warm, mid-20s Celsius, with light winds and clear skies. Perfect for sailing, or for sitting on deck, or for watching the fireworks that would light up the harbour that night. Hobart was busy. The waterfront was crowded with families, tourists, vendors selling flags and face paint. The tall ships were in for the summer festival. Music played from the docks. The river was full of boats. Bob and Sue had planned a quiet day. They would row out to the Four Winds together, do some maintenance, then head back to shore in the evening. Sue had been invited to a friend's barbecue. Bob said he might join later, or he might stay aboard. He had a lot to do. The toilet in the forward head was acting up again. There was a seacock that needed checking. He wanted to get it sorted. They left the dock around mid-morning. Sue rowed. Bob wasn't much for rowing, and they reached the Four Winds just after 10. The yacht was moored bow and stern, held in place by 2 lines running down to anchors on the riverbed. She sat low in the water, heavy with fuel and provisions. Bob climbed aboard first, then helped Sue up. They spent a few hours together in the cabin. Bob worked on the toilet. Sue tidied up, made sandwiches, listened to the radio. Around 2 in the afternoon, Sue decided to go ashore. She had errands to run, grocery shopping, a trip to the hardware store for Bob. He needed a new hose clamp, some sealant. She took the dinghy, a small inflatable tender with a 5-horsepower outboard motor, and motored back to the yacht club dock. Bob stayed behind. He was in the middle of something. He would be fine. That was the last time she saw him alive. Or so she says. The dinghy was a Zodiac-style inflatable, gray and worn, with a wooden transom and a pull-start motor that took 3 tries on a good day. It was not glamorous. It was transport. You loaded it with shopping bags and fuel cans and oars, and you motored back and forth between the yacht and the shore, and you got wet when the wind picked up, and you cursed when the motor stalled. But it was necessary. You could not live aboard a moored yacht without a dinghy. It was your link to land. Sue spent the afternoon on shore. She went to the hardware store. She stopped at a friend's house, dropped off some items, had a cup of tea. She went to the barbecue later, around 6 or 7, at another friend's place in Sandy Bay. People remember seeing her there. She seemed normal, relaxed. She had a drink, ate some food, chatted. She mentioned that Bob was still on the boat, working. She said she might row back out later to check on him, or she might just stay on shore. It was a holiday. No fixed plans. The fireworks started around 9. Big ones, launched from barges in the river. The crowd along the waterfront cheered. Sue watched for a while, then left the barbecue around 10. She told people she was going home. She had a house in Sandy Bay, a small weatherboard cottage a few streets back from the water. She and Bob still kept the house. They had not committed to living aboard full-time yet. She drove home, parked, went inside. Or at least that is what she said later. What happened next is where the story fractures. The night was warm. The river was dark. The fireworks had ended. The boats rocked in silence. Most of the moored yachts had their lights off. People were ashore, or asleep below. The Four Winds sat in the water like all the others. No movement, no sound, but someone was watching. A man walking his dog along the foreshore around midnight later told police he saw a dinghy moving across the river. A small inflatable, headed from the direction of the moored yachts towards the yacht club dock. One person aboard. He could not tell if it was a man or a woman. Too dark, too far, but the silhouette was slight, possibly female. The dinghy was moving slowly, without navigation lights. It reached the dock, and the figure climbed out, secured the painter, and walked away into the darkness. He did not think much of it at the time. People came and went from the moorings all night. But later, when the police asked, he remembered. Another witness, a woman living in an apartment overlooking the river, reported hearing a woman's voice around the same time. Late, past midnight. She could not make out the words, but it was agitated, raised, then silence. These sightings would become critical. Because if Sue Neal Fraser was home in bed by 11, as she claimed, then who was in the dinghy at midnight? And whose voice was heard? The prosecution would argue it was Sue. That she left her house, drove back to the yacht club, took the dinghy back out to the Four Winds under cover of darkness, and confronted Bob. That something happened aboard the yacht, an argument, a struggle, and that Bob Chappelle died there, alone with the woman he had trusted for 18 years. The defense would argue it was someone else, an intruder, a stranger, that Sue had nothing to do with it. But that would come later. For now, the night passed. The river was silent. By dawn on January 27th, the Four Winds was sinking. A couple rowing past the mooring around 6:30 in the morning noticed the yacht riding low. Too low. Her waterline was above the boot stripe, and her stern deck was barely a foot above the surface. She looked wrong, unbalanced, like a glass slowly filling. They rowed closer and called out. No answer. They pulled alongside and climbed aboard. The deck was wet, but that could be spray. The cabin hatch was unlocked. They slid it open and looked down. Water. A foot of it sloshing in the bilge. And blood. Not a lot. Not a murder scene from a film. But enough. Dark smears on the companionway steps. Spots on the teak trim. A heavy flashlight lying in the galley. Its lens cracked. Its handle stained. And in the wheelhouse, near the navigation station, a kitchen knife. Long blade. No sheath. Just lying there on the sole. They called the police immediately. Then they called the Coast Guard. Then they started bailing. The Tasmania police arrived within 20 minutes. Marine officers, forensic teams, detectives. They boarded the Four Winds carefully, preserving the scene as best they could, while also trying to stop the boat from sinking. Someone found the source of the flooding. A water pipe in the forward head had been cut, deliberately, with a saw or a knife, and the seacock for the toilet intake had been opened. Both measures designed to let water pour into the hull. This was not an accident. This was sabotage, and Bob Chappelle was nowhere to be found. They searched the cabin. Both berths, the engine compartment, the bilge, the deck lockers. They checked the mooring lines, the life raft, the anchor chain. Nothing. No body. No sign of where he had gone. Just his tools, his jacket, his wallet in the nav station, his phone, his glasses. A man does not leave his glasses behind. They called Sue. She answered on the third ring. She sounded groggy, confused. They told her Bob was missing. They told her the boat was taking on water. They asked her to come down to the yacht club. She arrived within half an hour, still in casual clothes, her face pale. "I don't understand," she said. "I left him yesterday afternoon. He was fine. He was working on the toilet." The detective asked her when she last saw him. 2:00, maybe 2:30. I went ashore to do errands." "And when did you last speak to him?" "I tried to call him last night, around 8. He didn't answer. I thought he was busy." "Did you go back to the boat?" No, I was at a barbecue. Then I went home. Are you sure? A pause. Yes, I'm sure. But she did not sound sure. They took her statement. They took her clothes. She was wearing jeans and a fleece, both damp around the cuffs. They swabbed her hands. They asked if Bob had enemies, if they had been fighting, if there was anyone else who might have been aboard. She said no. No enemies, no fight, no one else. They did not arrest her. Not yet. But they did not let her leave either. The forensic team worked through the day. They photographed the blood. They swabbed it, bagged it, catalogued it. They found Bob's DNA, his blood type, his genetic markers, mixed with the stains on the steps and the flashlight. But there was something else. Another profile. Partial. Unknown. Not Bob. Not Sue. Someone else had been aboard. They searched the dinghy next. It had been found earlier that morning, adrift near the rocks at Maryville Esplanade, about half a kilometer south of the mooring. The painter, the rope used to tie it off, had been cut, not untied. The motor was still attached, but the fuel line was disconnected. It looked like someone had abandoned it in a hurry. Inside the dinghy, they found a small amount of blood. Bob's type, and a pair of bolt cutters. Bolt cutters. Not a tool Bob would need for toilet repairs. They searched the river. Divers went down around the mooring. The water was murky, visibility less than a meter. They found nothing. The Derwent is deep in places, over 20 meters, and the current is strong. If a body went into the water that night, it could be anywhere. Downstream, caught in a piling, dragged out to sea. They searched for 3 days, then a week, then 2. No body. But they kept finding blood. On the deck, on the handrails, on the life raft canister. Small spots, easily missed, but there. The forensic pattern suggested movement. Someone bleeding, or someone carrying something bleeding, from the cabin to the stern. And then there was the knife. The big one, lying in the wheelhouse. It had been wiped clean. No blood, no prints. But it was out of place. It belonged in the galley, in a drawer. Why was it on the floor? The heavy flashlight, a Maglite-style torch, solid metal, heavy enough to crack bone. Had Bob's blood on the lens and the handle. The lens was cracked, the bulb shattered. It looked like it had struck something, or someone. The police began to build a theory. Bob had been attacked aboard the Four Winds sometime late on the night of January 26th. The attacker had used the flashlight as a weapon, struck him, possibly killed him, then tried to sink the boat to destroy the evidence, cut the pipe, open the seacock, let the river do the rest. But who and why? Sue Neal Fraser became the focus, not because of evidence exactly, but because of absence. Absence of alternatives, absence of alibi, absence of explanation. The midnight dinghy sighting, the wet clothes, the fact that she had access. Motive was harder. They had been together for 18 years. No reports of violence, no affairs, no debt. But investigators started digging. They looked at financials, at wills, at beneficiaries. Bob's estate was modest. Maybe $400,000, including the house and the boat. Sue was the primary beneficiary. Not a fortune, but not nothing. They looked at the relationship. Friends said they seemed fine, quiet, stable. But a few mentioned tension. Sue had not been thrilled about the boat. She thought it was a money pit. Bob had been obsessed with it, spent all his time aboard. Maybe she resented that. Maybe, but maybe is not evidence. They looked at the DNA, the unknown profile found on the yacht. It did not match anyone in the system. Not a convicted criminal, not a missing person, just someone. The police sent samples to the lab. They ran comparisons. They checked local transients, people who lived rough near the waterfront. And eventually, they got a hit. A teenage girl, homeless, known to police for petty theft. She had been in the area that night. Her DNA was on the deck of the Four Winds. Her name was Megan Vass. She was 17 years old. The police brought her in for questioning. She denied everything, said she had never been on the boat, didn't know Bob, didn't know Sue. The DNA must be a mistake, but DNA does not lie. So how did her genetic material end up on the Four Winds? And what did it mean? The police had two possibilities. One, she had been aboard recently, days or weeks before, during some unrelated incident. Maybe she climbed aboard, looking for something to steal when the boat was unattended. Her presence was coincidental. Or two, she had been there that night, the night Bob disappeared. And she knew more than she was saying. They could not prove either. Megan Vass had no fixed address, no alibi, no credibility. She was a ghost. And so the investigation circled back to Sue. By August 2009, the Tasmania police had decided. They had no body, no weapon they could definitively link to a killing, no witness. But they had blood. They had the sabotaged boat. They had the midnight dinghy. They had motive, however thin. They arrested Susan Neal Fraser and charged her with the murder of Robert Chappelle. She was 55 years old. She had no criminal record. She had spent 18 years with the man she was now accused of killing, and she said over and over that she had nothing to do with it. But the river had swallowed Bob Chappelle, and the Four Winds, half sunk and bloodied, could not speak for him. Only the evidence remained, and the questions. The morning the Four Winds was found sinking, the river was calm, glassy. The kind of stillness that makes you forget water is dangerous. Two rowers, early risers, the kind who chase dawn because it feels virtuous, noticed her first. The yacht sat wrong in the mooring, stern low, bow tilted up slightly, like a sinking animal trying to keep its head above water. They knew boats. They knew this was not right. They rowed closer, called out, "Hello? Anyone aboard?" Nothing. Just the soft slap of water against fiberglass and the creak of rigging. One of them climbed on. The deck was slick. He steadied himself on the cabin top and moved toward the hatch. It was unlocked, slid open easily. He looked down into the cabin and saw the water first, then the blood. He did not go farther. He climbed back into the dinghy, and they rowed hard for shore. They called 000 from the yacht club. Marine incident, possible injury, boat sinking, fast. Tasmania police arrived at 6:53. Marine officers first, then detectives. They boarded carefully, preserving what they could, while also trying to understand what they were looking at. The cabin was a mess. Not ransacked, nothing thrown about, but disturbed. A flashlight on the galley counter, blood on its lens, a knife on the floor near the navigation station, more blood on the companionway steps, dark smears already dried, and water rising. They traced it quickly. The forward head. Someone had cut through a water line, clean cut, deliberate, and opened the seacock. Both measures guaranteed flooding. Slow, but certain. If the boat had not been found when it was, the Four Winds would have slipped beneath the surface by midday. But why? Destroying evidence was the obvious answer. Sink the boat, sink the crime scene. Let the river erase what happened. But it was also panic. Desperation. Because scuttling a yacht this way is not subtle. It leaves marks. It tells a story. The detectives stood in the flooding cabin and tried to read it. A man was missing, blood on the boat, signs of struggle. The seacocks opened, the dinghy found adrift, and no body, no explanation, just silence. They called it in. Major crime, possible homicide, and then they started searching. The Derwent River is not kind to the dead. It is a tidal estuary, wide and deep, fed by the River Derwent and flushed twice a day by the Southern Ocean. The currents are strong. The bottom is silt and mud, and the remains of old moorings, sunken dinghies, shopping trolleys, things people have thrown away. Visibility underwater is less than a meter on a good day. On a bad day, you are working blind. The dive team went down around the mooring first. They searched in expanding circles. 15 meters. 20. Feeling their way across the bottom. They found nothing. No body, no weighted bag, no anchor with something tied to it. Just mud. They widened the search. Checked the shallows along the shoreline. The rocks at Maryville Esplanade, where the dinghy had been found. The pilings near the yacht club. The slipways. They brought in sonar. Swept the deeper channels. Still nothing. Bob Chappelle had vanished, and with every passing hour, the likelihood of finding him intact diminished. Bodies in water bloat and rise, usually within 3 to 5 days, depending on temperature. But they can also stay down, caught in debris, weighted, or torn apart by propellers, by currents, by the things that live in the dark. The search continued for 2 weeks, then a month, then it was called off. Bob Chappelle was gone, presumed dead. But without a body, the case was already complicated. Proving murder without remains is possible. It has been done, but it requires overwhelming circumstantial evidence, a clear timeline, a motive, a defendant with no alibi, and the police had their eyes on one person. Sue Neal Fraser was cooperative at first. She answered questions, she gave statements, she seemed confused, upset, disoriented. But the detectives noticed things. Small things. Inconsistencies. She said she had been at the barbecue until around 10, then driven home and gone to bed. But a neighbor reported seeing her car leave the driveway again around 11:30. Sue later amended her statement. She said she had gone out briefly to buy cigarettes. Then it was milk. Then it was just... She couldn't sleep, so she drove around. Why lie about something so small? She said she had not been back to the Four Winds after leaving Bob at 2 in the afternoon. But the midnight dinghy sighting placed someone, possibly a woman, rowing from the mooring back to shore. Sue said it could not have been her. She was home, but the timing did not hold. And then there were the clothes. When the police arrived at her house on the morning of the 27th, Sue was wearing jeans and a fleece. Both were damp. She said she had spilled tea. They took the clothes anyway. Forensic tests later found river water, salt residue, microscopic traces of marine algae consistent with the Derwent estuary. She had been near the water recently. Sue maintained her innocence. She said she had no idea what had happened to Bob. She loved him. They had no reason to fight. She could not explain the blood, the flooding, the dinghy. She could not explain the DNA of a stranger on the boat. She could only repeat, again and again, that she did not do this. But the evidence kept stacking. The flashlight, the heavy maglite found in the galley, had Bob's blood on it. Type O positive. His DNA. The lens was cracked, the bulb shattered. Forensic analysts determined it had been used as a blunt instrument, struck against something, or someone, with significant force. The blood spatter on the companionway steps told a similar story. Not a spray, not arterial, but transfer. Someone bleeding, or something bloodied, had moved through the cabin, from the main salon, down the steps, towards the stern. The knife on the floor had been wiped clean. No blood, no prints. But it was a galley knife, serrated, long-bladed, the kind you use to cut meat. It did not belong on the floor of the wheelhouse. Someone had moved it, used it, then tried to clean it. And then there was the scuttling, the cut pipe, the opened seacock. Marine engineers confirmed that both actions required knowledge. You had to know where the seacocks were. You had to know which valves to open. Bob would have known. He had been working on the plumbing for weeks. Sue would have seen him do it, watched him, learned. The police built a theory. Sue had returned to the Four Winds late on the night of January 26th. She and Bob had argued. About what, they could not say. Money, the boat, the future, something. The argument escalated. She grabbed the flashlight, struck him. He fell, bled. She panicked, tried to clean up, realized she could not. So she decided to sink the boat, cut the pipe, opened the valve, let the river take the evidence. Then she took Bob's body, wrapped it, weighted it, loaded it into the dinghy, and motored out into the darkness, dumped him somewhere deep, cut the dinghy loose to make it look like an accident, rowed back to shore in… what? A backup dinghy? Swam. The details were murky, but the shape of it made sense, or so the prosecution would argue. The defense would say it was absurd. Sue was 54 years old, not strong, not violent. Bob was 65, but he was taller, heavier. How could she overpower him? How could she move his body alone? And why? 18 years together. No history of abuse, no affairs, no insurance payout worth killing for. But juries do not need perfect logic. They need a story that fits the evidence better than the alternative. And the alternative, that a stranger had come aboard, killed Bob, and scuttled the boat, required believing in a coincidence. A random intruder on a random night. An attack with no apparent motive. A girl's DNA on the deck with no explanation. Coincidences make bad defenses. Still, that DNA haunted the case. Megan Voss, 17, homeless, no fixed address. She had been in the Sandy Bay area on the night of January 26th. That much was confirmed. She was known to police for shoplifting, loitering, petty theft. She had friends, other street kids, who slept rough near the waterfront. Some of them had been seen around the yacht club. Had they gone aboard the Four Winds that night? Looking for something to steal? Cash? Electronics? Booze? Had they encountered Bob? Had things gone wrong? The police questioned Megan twice. Both times she denied everything. She had never been on the boat. She did not know Bob. She had no idea how her DNA got there. Must be a mistake. Must be contamination. But forensic contamination is rare. And her DNA was not trace. Not a single skin cell that could have transferred from a handshake. It was a full profile. Found on the deck, near the stern. The police pressed her. Where were you that night? She could not say. Or would not. Who were you with? She would not say. What were you doing? Silence. They had no leverage. She was a minor. No prior serious enough to charge. No evidence directly linking her to violence. Just her DNA in the wrong place. So they let her go. And the investigation circled back to Sue. By winter of 2009, July, August, the cold months when Hobart's waterfront empties and the boats sit under tarps, the police had made their decision. They had interviewed dozens of witnesses, collected hundreds of samples, reconstructed the timeline as best they could, and they had concluded that Susan Neal Fraser was the only person with means, motive, and opportunity. She had access to the boat. She knew the layout. She knew how to operate the dinghy. She knew where the seacocks were. She had been seen, or possibly seen, near the river late that night. Her clothes were wet. Her story kept changing. And Bob was gone. On August 20th, 2009, police arrested Sue at her home in Sandy Bay. They read her the charges. Murder. 1 count. She did not resist, did not shout, just stood there, pale and silent, and let them cuff her. She said only one thing as they led her to the car. I didn't do this. The media descended within hours. Tasmania is a small place. Hobart smaller still. A missing physicist. A blood-stained yacht. A woman accused of murder. It had everything. Mystery. Betrayal. The sea. The case became known simply as the Four Winds murder. Papers ran photos of the yacht. White hull. Elegant lines. 2 masts silhouetted against the Derwent. They ran photos of Sue. Middle-aged, unremarkable, The kind of woman you would pass in the supermarket without a second glance. And they ran photos of Bob, smiling, glasses, graying hair. A man who loved boats. Public opinion split immediately. Some believed Sue was guilty. Guilty because she had lied. Guilty because the evidence pointed to her. Guilty because the alternative required believing in a phantom. Others believed she was being railroaded. A woman with no history of violence, no clear motive. Convicted on circumstantial evidence because the police needed someone to blame. Because Bob's family needed closure. Because a missing body and an unsolved case made everyone uncomfortable. The debate raged in letters to the editor, on talk radio, in pubs. It became a kind of Rorschach test. What you believed about Sue said something about what you believed about women, about violence, about the justice system. The trial was set for October 2010, over a year after Bob's disappearance. Time enough for memories to fade. Time enough for the media to build the story into something larger than itself. And time enough for Sue to sit in remand and wonder how her life had come to this. The Four Winds was eventually refloated, towed to a shipyard, repaired. The cut pipe was replaced, the seacocks closed, the blood cleaned away. She was sold at auction for a fraction of what Bob and Sue had paid. The new owners renamed her. They did not want the association, did not want people pointing as they sailed past. But boats remember. Even with a new name, a new coat of paint, the Four Winds carried the weight of what had happened aboard her. The planks that had been stained, the deck where someone had bled, the cabin where a man had spent his last conscious moments. She had been a dream once, a floating promise of freedom, and now she was evidence, a silent witness. The prosecution would walk the jury through her, point to the bloodstains, the cut pipe, the open valve. They would show photos, diagrams. They would explain how long it takes for a yacht to flood, how much water, how heavy a body would be. The defense would argue she proved nothing. That blood and sabotage did not equal murder, that Sue had no reason to kill the man she loved. But the Four Winds would sit at the center of it all. A 53-foot ketch, hull number still on file, registration still active. A vessel built to carry people safely across oceans, now tied forever to the question of how one man died and whether the woman beside him was the one who killed him. The trial would answer nothing. Not really. It would only decide guilt. And guilt, in the absence of a body, is just a story we agree to believe. The trial began on October 18th, 2010. Supreme Court of Tasmania, Hobart. A sandstone building on Salamanca Place, old and heavy, the kind of architecture that makes you speak quietly, even in the hallways. The courtroom was packed. Media, Bob's family, Sue's supporters, curious locals who had followed the case in the papers and wanted to see how it would end. Sue sat in the dock. She wore a dark blouse, no jewelry, her hair pulled back. She looked smaller than she had in the photographs. Older. The kind of tired that comes from a year in remand, waiting. The judge was Alan Blow, experienced, deliberate. He had presided over murder trials before, but few like this. No body. No weapon definitively linked to a killing. No eyewitness. Just blood, circumstance, and a woman who said she was innocent. The prosecution was led by Tim Ellis, Director of Public Prosecutions for Tasmania. Methodical, precise. He opened with a simple statement. Bob Chappelle was murdered aboard the Four Winds on the night of January 26th, 2009. The person responsible tried to destroy the evidence by sinking the yacht. That person is the accused, Susan Neal Fraser. He laid out the timeline. Bob and Sue aboard the yacht in the afternoon. Sue leaving around 2. Bob staying behind. Sue's movements through the evening. Errands, the barbecue. Her claim that she went home. The midnight sighting of a dinghy. The wet clothes, the contradictions in her story, and then the boat, the blood, the flashlight, the cut pipe, the opened sea cock. Ellis told the jury that this was not a mystery. It was a tragedy born of a relationship under strain, that Sue had grown resentful, that the Four Winds, which was supposed to be their shared dream, had become Bob's obsession, that money was tight, that Sue stood to inherit everything if Bob died. He did not claim to know the exact sequence. He admitted that, but he said the evidence told the story clearly enough. Sue had returned to the yacht. There had been a confrontation. She had struck Bob with the flashlight. He had bled. She had panicked, tried to clean up, realized she couldn't, and decided to sink the boat. Then she had disposed of his body. How exactly was unclear. But the Derwent River is deep and dark, and it does not give up its dead easily. The defense was led by Barbara Etter, later replaced partway through by a team including solicitor Rosemary Davy. Their strategy was simple: raise doubt, poke holes, show that the prosecution's story, while possible, was not the only explanation. Etter opened by reminding the jury of a basic principle. The burden of proof was on the Crown, not on Sue. Sue did not have to prove her innocence. The prosecution had to prove her guilt, beyond reasonable doubt. And there was plenty of doubt. No body, no murder weapon. Yes, the flashlight had blood on it, but no one had proven it caused a fatal injury. No motive strong enough to make sense. And most importantly, the DNA of a stranger on the yacht. A teenage girl with a history of theft, found on the deck of the Four Winds with no innocent explanation. "Someone else was aboard that night," Etter said. "Someone the prosecution cannot account for. And until they can, you cannot convict." The trial would last 4 weeks. The evidence came in slowly, piece by piece, like assembling a boat from a kit with half the parts missing. The forensic team took the stand first. Dr. Karen Aspinall, forensic biologist. She walked the jury through the blood evidence, where it was found, whose it was, how much. The largest concentration was on the companionway steps. 8 distinct stains. All Bob's blood. Type O positive. DNA confirmed. The pattern suggested contact transfer. Someone or something bloodied had brushed against the steps while moving through the cabin. There was also blood on the Maglite flashlight, smeared on the handle, a small spot on the lens. Again, Bob's. The lens was cracked, the bulb shattered, consistent with impact. But impact with what? Dr. Aspinall could not say. There were no bone fragments, no tissue, no hair, just blood. She could not confirm the flashlight had struck a person, only that it had been in contact with Bob's blood at some point. The defense pressed her. Could the blood have gotten on the flashlight some other way? If Bob had cut himself, on a tool on the boat, and then picked up the flashlight, would that leave the same pattern? Possibly, she admitted. But the cracked lens suggested force. Force, the defense replied, not necessarily violence. The prosecution brought in a pathologist, Dr. Donald Ritchie. He had reviewed the blood evidence, the photographs, the reports. He testified that the volume of blood found on the boat, approximately 200 milliliters, roughly a cup, was consistent with a significant injury, a head wound, a deep laceration, something serious, but not necessarily fatal. People survive head wounds. They bleed heavily, but they live. Without a body, without an autopsy, he could not say definitively that Bob Chappelle had died from his injuries. But, Ellis pressed, given the amount of blood, the subsequent disappearance of Mr. Chappelle, and the fact that his body has never been found, is it reasonable to conclude he is dead? Yes, Dr. Ritchie said, I believe he is deceased. And is it reasonable to conclude his death resulted from violence? A pause. Yes, I believe so. The defense objected. Belief was not evidence, but the judge allowed it. The pathologist was offering an expert opinion based on the available facts. The marine engineers came next. They explained the scuttling. The cut pipe in the forward head was a plastic water line, part of the pressurized freshwater system. It had been severed cleanly, likely with a knife or a saw. Once cut, water from the tank would flow freely into the bilge. But that alone would not sink the boat. The freshwater tank held maybe 80 liters, enough to make a mess, but not enough to flood the hull. The real damage was the seacock. Seacocks are valves that allow water to flow in or out of the boat, for the toilet, the engine cooling system, the galley sink. Normally they are closed or open only when needed. On the forewinds, the seacock for the forward head had been opened fully. That meant river water was pouring directly into the bilge, at a rate of roughly 15 liters per minute. Over the course of 6 hours, from midnight to dawn, that was 5,400 liters. Enough to sink a boat this size if the bilge pumps were off or overwhelmed. And the bilge pumps had been off. The battery switch was in the off position when the boat was found. Why? The prosecution argued Sue had turned them off to ensure the boat would sink. The defense argued Bob might have turned them off himself. Standard procedure when leaving a boat unattended for the night to prevent draining the batteries. Impossible to know. But the combination, cut pipe, open seacock, pumps off, was damning. It suggested intent. Someone wanted the four winds on the bottom of the Derwent. The dinghy evidence came next. The Zodiac had been found adrift near Maryville Esplanade around 7 in the morning of January 27th. The painter, the rope tied to the bow, had been cut. Not untied, not frayed. Cut cleanly, as if with a knife. Inside the dinghy, forensic officers found a small blood stain, Bob's blood, and a pair of bolt cutters. Why bolt cutters? The prosecution suggested they had been used to cut the mooring lines. Perhaps Sue had planned to set the four winds adrift after scuttling her, to make it look like the yacht had broken free and sunk on its own. But the moorings had not been cut. They were intact. The defense suggested the bolt cutters belonged to Bob, that he kept them aboard for maintenance, that their presence proved nothing. And the blood? A drop. A smear. Bob could have cut himself earlier in the day, touched the dinghy, left a trace. People bleed. Boats are full of sharp edges. The prosecution brought witnesses. The man who had seen the dinghy at midnight. He took the stand, nervous, unsure. He said he had been walking his dog along the foreshore. He saw a small inflatable moving across the water. No lights. One person aboard. He could not identify the person. Could not say if it was a man or woman. Just a silhouette. But the dinghy was moving from the moorings toward the yacht club. That much he was sure of. What time? Around midnight. Maybe 12:15. And you're certain it was that night? January 26th? Yes. It was Australia Day. He remembered because of the fireworks. The defense cross-examined. You said you couldn't tell if the person was male or female, correct? Correct. You couldn't see their face. No. Couldn't hear their voice? No. So it could have been anyone. A pause. Yes, it could have been anyone. Another witness. A woman living in an apartment on Maryville Esplanade. She testified that she heard a woman's voice late that night. Around midnight. Raised. Agitated. She could not make out the words, but it was definitely a woman. Where was the voice coming from? Near the water. Maybe the beach. Maybe a boat. Could you see anyone? No. It was dark. How do you know it was a woman? The pitch, the tone. She had raised 3 daughters. She knew what a woman sounded like when she was upset. The defense pressed. Could it have been a television? A radio? I don't think so. But you can't be sure. No, I can't be sure. The prosecution called Sue's friends, the people from the barbecue. They testified that Sue had been there from around 6 until 10. She seemed normal, relaxed. She had a glass of wine, maybe two. She talked about Bob, mentioned he was still on the boat working. She did not seem anxious, did not seem like someone planning murder. But she left around 10. Said she was going home. Did anyone see her after that? No. The neighbor testified. The one who lived across the street from Sue's house. He said he saw her car leave the driveway around 11:30. He was watching television. Heard the engine, looked out the window, saw the headlights. Did you see her return? No. I went to bed. The prosecution leaned on this. Sue had lied. She said she went home and stayed home. But the car had left. Where did she go? Sue's explanation, amended, reluctant, was that she could not sleep. She drove to a convenience store to buy cigarettes. Then she drove around for a while. She did that sometimes when she was restless. Which store? She could not remember. What time did you return home? She was not sure. Maybe midnight. Maybe later. The prosecution painted this as consciousness of guilt. An innocent person would remember. An innocent person would have a clear alibi. Sue's story kept shifting because she was trying to cover her movements. The defense painted it as the fog of trauma. Sue had just learned her partner was missing. She was in shock. Memory under stress is unreliable. The fact that she could not recall every detail did not make her a killer. And then came the DNA. Dr. Aspinall returned to the stand. She explained that during the forensic examination of the Four Winds, swabs had been taken from multiple surfaces. Most came back with Bob's DNA, or Sue's, or a mixture, expected. They lived on the boat, but one swab, taken from the deck near the starboard stern, came back with a profile that matched neither of them. A female, unknown. The sample was run through the national database. No match. Then through the Tasmanian database. Still no match. Then, months later, a routine sample from a minor offender, Megan Vass, arrested for shoplifting, came back as a hit. Her DNA. On the deck of the Four Winds. This was the defense's key argument. Someone else had been aboard. Someone with no connection to Bob or Sue. Someone who had no reason to be there. The prosecution tried to explain it away. Vass was a transient. She had likely been on or near the yacht at some point before January 26th. Maybe she climbed aboard when it was unattended, looking for something to steal. Her DNA was irrelevant to the murder. But the defense hammered it. How do you know it was before? How do you know she wasn't there that night? The prosecution had no answer, because Megan Vass refused to testify. She was subpoenaed. But she did not appear. A warrant was issued. She could not be found. So the DNA sat there, unresolved, a ghost in the evidence. The defense called character witnesses, friends of Bob and Sue, colleagues, neighbors, all said the same thing. They were a quiet couple, stable, no fights, no drama. Bob loved the boat. Sue tolerated it. They had their routines. They were planning to retire together. Did you ever see any signs of violence? No. Any indication Sue was unhappy? No more than anyone. She joked sometimes that Bob spent too much time on the boat. But it was a joke. Do you believe Sue could have killed Bob? Every single witness said no. But belief is not evidence. The prosecution's closing argument was clinical. Ellis walked the jury through the timeline again. The lies, the wet clothes, the midnight sighting, the scuttled boat, the blood. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no perfect murder. There is no perfect cover-up. But what we have here is an attempt. An attempt to make Bob Chappelle disappear. An attempt to sink the evidence. An attempt to blame it on an accident, or a stranger, or bad luck. But the evidence does not lie. Susan Neal Fraser had means. She had opportunity. And while motive may be unclear, it does not have to be. People kill for reasons that make sense only to them. The question is not why. The question is whether the evidence proves she did it. And it does. The defense's closing was emotional. Etter stood before the jury and asked them to imagine. Imagine being accused of murdering the person you loved. Imagine spending a year in jail, waiting for a trial, knowing you did nothing wrong. Imagine sitting in this courtroom while people who have never met you decide whether you will spend the rest of your life in prison. The prosecution wants you to believe Sue is guilty because they cannot imagine anyone else. But someone else was aboard that yacht. Megan Vass. Her DNA proves it. And until the Crown can explain her presence, until they can prove she was not involved, you must have doubt. And doubt means acquittal. The jury deliberated for 5 days, longer than expected. A sign, some thought, of disagreement. But on November 5th, 2010, they returned. Guilty. Sue's face went blank. She did not cry, did not shout, just stared ahead as the foreman read the verdict. Bob's family wept quietly. Relief, closure, justice they believed had been done. Sue's supporters sat in stunned silence. The judge set a sentencing date for December. When that day came, Justice Blow did not mince words. He said the crime was calculated, that Sue had tried to destroy evidence by scuttling the yacht, that she had shown no remorse. He sentenced her to 23 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 18 years. Sue was 56 years old. If she served the full term, she would be 74 before release. She was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. She turned once, looked back at her supporters, and mouthed 2 words, "I'm innocent." The sentence fell like a hatch slamming shut. 23 years. The courtroom emptied slowly. Bob's family left through a side door, shielded from cameras. Sue's supporters lingered in the hallway, shell-shocked, whispering about appeals, about injustice, about how this could not stand. But it did stand. For years. Sue was transferred to the Risdon prison complex just outside Hobart. A low-security facility for women, but a prison nonetheless. Concrete, wire, locked doors. She was assigned a cell, given a number, told the rules, and she began the slow, grinding process of existing inside. She maintained her innocence. Every day. To anyone who would listen. She wrote letters. She gave interviews through her lawyers. She said she did not kill Bob. She said she loved him. She said the system had failed her. But the system, officially, had spoken. Still, doubts remained. Not just among her friends, but among legal experts, journalists, retired detectives. The case had problems. Too many loose ends. Too much circumstantial evidence presented as fact. And that DNA. Megan Vass. The girl whose genetic material was found on the Four Winds, and who had never been properly explained. Sue's legal team began preparing an appeal immediately. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that the judge had misdirected the jury, that the DNA evidence should have created reasonable doubt, that the prosecution's theory, while plausible, was not the only theory, and therefore not proof beyond reasonable doubt. The first appeal was lodged in 2011. It was denied. The Court of Criminal Appeal found that the trial had been conducted properly, that the jury had been entitled to reach the verdict they did, that the evidence, taken as a whole, supported a conviction. Sue's team tried again. Different grounds, different arguments, again denied. But they did not stop, because new information was emerging. In 2014, a documentary crew began investigating the case. They interviewed witnesses the police had not spoken to. They reviewed forensic reports. They tracked down Megan Vass. She was in her early 20s by then. Still transient, still struggling. But she agreed to talk. Off camera, she admitted something. She had been on the Four Winds that night. January 26th, 2009. She and 2 men, friends, street people, had rowed out to the yacht looking for things to steal. They thought it was empty. But Bob was aboard. What happened? She would not say. Not clearly. But she implied there had been a confrontation. That one of the men had hit Bob. That things had gone wrong. That they had panicked and left. Did you see Bob die? She would not answer. Did you see his body? She would not answer. But she swore, repeatedly, that Sue Neal Fraser had not been there. That she had never seen Sue. That whatever happened to Bob, it was not Sue who did it. The documentary aired in 2017. It was called Shadow of Doubt. It caused a sensation. Public opinion swung. Protests were held outside Parliament House in Hobart. People carried signs. Free Sue Neal Fraser. Justice delayed is justice denied. Bob's family released a statement. They said they stood by the conviction. They said Megan Vass was not credible. That she was lying to get attention. That Sue had been found guilty by a jury and that verdict should be respected. But the pressure mounted. Sue's lawyers filed another appeal. This time they had new evidence. Megan Vass's admission, on record, that she had been aboard the yacht. They argued this was material evidence that had not been available at trial, that it directly contradicted the prosecution's theory, that it warranted a retrial. The appeal was heard in 2019. Megan Vass was subpoenaed to testify. She appeared, reluctantly. In the witness box, she was evasive, hostile. She admitted her DNA was on the boat. She admitted she had been there at some point. But when pressed about the night of January 26th, she became vague. Were you on the Four Winds that night? A long pause. Maybe. Maybe? I don't remember. You told the documentary crew you were there. I was confused. I was high a lot back then. I don't know what I said. The prosecution tore into her. They painted her as unreliable. A drug user. A petty criminal. Someone willing to say anything for money or attention. They argued her testimony was worthless. The defense argued the opposite. That her DNA was physical proof she had been aboard. That her reluctance to testify was because she was afraid. Afraid of incriminating herself. Afraid of the men she had been with. But without a clear statement, without corroboration, the court was skeptical. In 2020, the appeal was denied. Again. The judges found that while Vass's DNA was concerning, it did not prove she had been aboard on the night of the murder. It could have been deposited earlier. And even if she had been there, it did not prove Sue was innocent. The two were not mutually exclusive. Sue's supporters were devastated. Her lawyers vowed to keep fighting. But the legal avenues were narrowing. Sue had been in prison for over a decade by then. She was in her mid-60s. Her health was declining. She had developed arthritis, high blood pressure, the kind of ailments that come from age and stress and sleeping on a thin mattress in a concrete room. But she did not break. She gave interviews from prison. Carefully controlled, supervised, but interviews nonetheless. She spoke calmly, methodically. She said she had spent 11 years thinking about that night, trying to understand what had happened to Bob, trying to piece together how her life had ended up here. She said she thought about the Four Winds often. The boat they had bought together, the plans they had made. She said Bob would have hated what the yacht had become, a symbol of violence, of loss. He had loved that boat. She said she still loved him, that she thought about him every day, that she wished she knew what had happened, that she wished his body had been found so he could have been buried properly. She said she did not kill him. She had never killed anyone. She could not. People believed her. Not everyone, but enough. A campaign formed. Retired judges, legal academics, forensic experts. They reviewed the case files. They wrote open letters. They argued that the conviction was unsafe, that too much had been assumed, that the lack of a body, the lack of a clear motive, the presence of unknown DNA, All of it should have created doubt. One former Supreme Court judge called it the most troubling conviction in Tasmania's history. But the system does not easily admit mistakes. In 2021, Sue became eligible for parole. She had served 13 years, more than half her sentence. Her behavior in prison had been exemplary. No incidents, no infractions. She had worked in the library, tutored other inmates, kept to herself. The parole board reviewed her case. They asked the standard questions. Do you accept responsibility for your crime? Do you show remorse? Sue said no. She could not accept responsibility for something she did not do. She could not show remorse for a crime she did not commit. Normally, that would be disqualifying. Parole is predicated on rehabilitation, on acknowledgement of guilt. But Sue's case was unusual, high profile, politically sensitive. The board debated, delayed. Then, in early 2022, they made a decision. Sue Neal-Fraser would be released on parole, not because they believed she was innocent, but because she had served sufficient time, because she was no longer considered a risk to the community, because she was an old woman who had spent 13 years in prison and posed no threat. The conditions were strict. She would be monitored. She could not leave Tasmania. She had to report regularly. She could not contact Bob's family. She could not speak publicly about the case without permission. But she was free. On a cold morning in June 2022, Sue walked out of Risdon prison. She was 68 years old, thinner, grayer. She wore donated clothes. She carried a small bag. She did not smile. A small group of supporters waited outside. They hugged her, took photos. She said a few words. I am grateful to be out, but I am not free. Not really. Not while people still think I killed Bob. I will spend the rest of my life trying to clear my name. Bob's family released a statement that same day. They said they were disappointed, that Sue had been convicted by a jury, that the justice system had worked, that releasing her did not change the facts. They said they still believed she was guilty. The case did not end with Sue's release. It lingers, unresolved, unfinished. The Four Winds still exists. She was sold after the trial, renamed Wingaday. The new owners refitted her, replaced the bloodied wood, repainted the cabin, sailed her north, away from Tasmania, away from the weight of history. But boats carry memory in ways we do not fully understand. In the grain of the wood, in the curve of the hull, in the way water sounds against the planks at night. The people who sail her now know the story. Everyone in Australian yachting circles knows. Some refuse to step aboard. Others are curious, morbid. They want to see the cabin where it happened, the steps where the blood was found, the forward head where the pipe was cut. The boat does not care. She floats. She sails. She does what boats do. But there is a shadow in her history that will not lift. Bob Chappelle's body was never found. The Derwent River is deep. Currents are strong. Bodies can travel far. Or they can stay down, trapped in debris, weighted by silt, invisible. Some believe he is still there, somewhere in the dark water. Others believe he was taken farther, out past the Iron Pot Lighthouse, into the Southern Ocean, where the currents run cold and fast and bodies are never recovered. His family held a memorial service in 2010 after the trial. No body, no burial. Just words and memories and a plaque near the waterfront. They have never stopped believing Sue was responsible. They have never wavered. Sue has never stopped saying she is innocent. She has never wavered either. And so the case sits. A murder without a body. A conviction without certainty. A story with no clean ending. Forensic experts still debate the evidence. The blood spatter, the flashlight, the scuttling. Some say it all points to Sue. That the timeline, the opportunity, the physical evidence, it is enough. More than enough. Others say it is not. That Megan Voss's DNA is the key. That her presence, Unexplained, unresolved means someone else was aboard. That the prosecution's theory is just one possibility among many. That a jury should never have convicted. Legal scholars study the case in classrooms now. It has become a teaching tool, a cautionary tale about circumstantial evidence, about the burden of proof, about what happens when a system is too certain. The public remains divided. Online forums argue endlessly. Podcasts dissect every detail. True crime enthusiasts pick over the evidence like scavengers, looking for the piece that will make it all make sense. But there is no such piece. There never was. The night of January 26th, 2009, remains a black box. We know Bob was aboard the Four Winds. We know Sue went ashore. We know someone, possibly Sue, possibly Megan Voss, possibly others, was near the yacht late that night. We know Bob bled. We know the boat was sabotaged. We know Bob disappeared. Everything else is inference, interpretation, theory. Was Sue guilty? A jury said yes. The appeals courts agreed. She served 13 years. She is marked forever as a convicted murderer. But she says no. And a portion of the country believes her. Was Megan Voss involved? Her DNA says she was aboard. But when? And doing what? She will not say, cannot say, or will not be believed if she does. Were there others? 2 men, as Voss once hinted? Shadows on the water. Never identified, never caught? We do not know. Bob's final moments are unknown. Was he struck suddenly, without warning? Did he fight? Did he call out? Did he die aboard the yacht, or in the water, or somewhere else entirely? We do not know. The Four Winds, now Wingerdee, sails on, a beautiful boat. 53 feet of teak and brass and history. She has carried families on holidays. Crossed Bass Strait. Anchored in quiet bays where the only sound is the wind. But she was also a crime scene. A place where violence occurred. A sealed world, floating in darkness, where something terrible unfolded, and only the boat bore witness. Boats do not speak, but they remember. In the way wood remembers pressure. In the way metal remembers stress. In the places where blood soaked into grain and could never quite be sanded away. The Derwent River flows on. Wide, cold, tidal. It has swallowed secrets before. Wrecks, bodies, evidence. It keeps what it takes. Hobart remains a city of boats. Yachts line the waterfront. The Sydney to Hobart race ends here every year. The harbour filled with sails and celebration. Life goes on. But those who were there in 2009 remember. The morning the Four Winds was found sinking. The blood. The missing man. The woman led away in handcuffs. Tasmania is a small place. Memories are long. Sue lives quietly now. In a small unit, monitored, restricted. She is working on another appeal. She says there is new evidence, new witnesses. She says the truth will come out. Bob's family says the truth already has. And the rest of us are left to choose. Who to believe. What to accept. Whether justice was served or justice failed. There is no answer. Not one that satisfies. Not one that closes the wound. Because this is not a detective novel. There is no final chapter where the pieces fall into place and the truth is revealed. This is real, messy, incomplete. A man is dead. A woman is convicted. A boat floats on, and the river keeps its secrets. The Four Winds murder remains one of Australia's most controversial cases. Not because of what we know, but because of what we do not. Not because the evidence is clear, but because it is not. It divides, it haunts, it refuses to resolve. And perhaps that is the truest thing about it. That some stories do not end. They only stop. Frozen in the moment before understanding, before closure, before peace. Bob Chappelle deserved better. A proper burial. A clear accounting of his death. Justice if justice can ever really be achieved. Sue Neal Fraser deserves better. If she is innocent, she lost 13 years. If she is guilty, she lost 18 years with the man she says she loved. And the Four Winds, Wingadee, deserves to be just a boat again. Beautiful, functional, free of ghosts. But none of them will get what they deserve, because the river does not care. The boat does not care. Time moves forward, indifferent, and the past becomes a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the senseless. So we are left with questions and doubt, and the image of a yacht, white hull against dark water, rocking gently in the current, holding in its wooden bones the memory of a night when everything changed and nothing was ever clear again. Blood everywhere, but no body, a conviction, but no certainty, a case closed, but never solved, and a river, wide and cold, that will never give up what it knows.